On the 15th, FNX went inactive or was kicked from Immortals. In many ways, you could call this the inevitable destiny of FNX's career because that was FNX's character, and the philosopher Heraclitus once said something along the lines of, "Your character is your fate," and what he meant by that was your actions are all informed by who you are as a person, and those actions end up deciding your future and what kind of life you live. So inevitably, it all comes back down to the character, to the self. So if you want to change your fate, if you want to change who you are or who you become, you have to first change your character, and that will change your destiny. So when it comes to esports, inevitably character flaws are often what can limit a player's success. Even in like a 1v1 game, like famously in my last video I talked about Marine King's stubbornness and his inability to adapt or change how he saw the game, and that was what kept him from moving on to the next level, becoming an even better player. In team games, it's exacerbated because even if you are a godly player, if your character is such that you are unable to like work with other players or get them to understand you or communicate with them, you can be kicked no matter how good you are. And this famously happened to Simple multiple times in his career, despite the fact that he had clearly like some of the best talent we'd ever seen in CS:GO. In FNX's case, this latest kick was just a long cycle that's been happening ever since his CS 1.6 days. He was kicked from MIBR. He was kicked from Fire Gamers. Later, when he teamed up with Fallen, he was kicked again for a lack of motivation. And then this is where the story was supposed to change, right? So around the end of 2015, the the Fallen team, Luminosity Gaming, they were at a crossroads where they had basically reached like the peak of what they could probably do with that particular lineup. So going into, I think it was Face It stage 3, going to Face It stage 3 land finals, they decided that they had to make a change, and the change they made was to bring in Taco and FNX. And at the time, they weren't sure about FNX, they but FNX was on Games Academy, and they heard a lot of good things from Games Academy about like the change in FNX's character, where he had motivation, he was trying harder, he was being a better teammate. So they thought, okay, well, this guy always had that talent, he always had that skill, he was always a great FPS player. So they decided to bring him in, and that was like the beginning. That ended up being like the prologue or the beginning of what would eventually become the Luminosity slash SK era or run. And I guess Valve got bought into that story too, because they made that entire Valve profile about him, about FNX, and how he had finally changed his ways. He had been reborn as the Phoenix. How he said this was his very last chance to stay on the top team, and that's why he was trying his hardest. And it did work out for a while. This team did eventually become the best team in the world. This team did eventually win 2 majors. This team got multiple tournaments, multiple top finishes, but the story remained the same. The character of FNX could not change, and because his character could not change, his fate, I guess, didn't change either. At the end of 2016, you could kind of see this. Both you could clearly see this without actually knowing about the players, or without knowing the players personally or reading in their interviews, because at that point in time, SK could have uh, moved on, could have won. I think could have become the best team during the uncertainty era, or what we now call the uncertainty era. But their fatal flaw was that they were unable to change. They were unable to adapt. They were unable to learn, and this was a very strange flaw at the time, because if you asked me what was the characteristic for why that Brazilian team rose to the top, it was because they could learn from their mistakes. They were one of the best teams at learning from their mistakes, but they were unable to do it during this time. And part of it might have been because Zeus wasn't there, but a very big part of it ended up being because FNX as a player was unwilling to change. And while we never really got the full story of why FNX was eventually kicked from the squad, we do know that from past experiences, it could have just been a motivation, or it could have been the fact that he was unwilling to change. Because every other player that went into that system, the fallen system, I call it, inevitably almost all of them were forced to change, and they were all given time to. They were all given a pretty good amount of time generally to learn under the system, play under the system, and change according to whatever they needed to be for the team to win. And you see this with Taco. You saw this with Fur. You saw this a little bit with Coldzera. Coldzera didn't really need to change because he was a superstar player. You saw this earlier with Bolts and Steel and those guys. But FNX didn't change, and inevitably he went to Immortals because that was the second best Brazilian team. And FNX, while he was playing a supportive role in SK, he was a very skilled. He was still a very skilled player, and he should have, and was, I think, like one of the star players for that team. When for the brief amount of time he played for them, and they got pretty good results, all things considered, for the amount of time they had together for the competitions they played in. Some of them were bad, some of them were really good, but inevitably the results weren't enough, and his character wasn't his character or his flaws created a bunch of internal issues that eventually made Immortals decide we have to kick this guy. It's a very similar parallel to when SK themselves kicked FNX at the end of 2016, because the timing of it was very odd because they were running up to the E-League major. So by kicking FNX at that point, they were basically saying we don't even want to like ride it out with this guy. We'd rather get in a player we've never played with. In that case, it was Fox, and we'd rather rebuild and retool everything and know that this is basically all just for one tournament, and Fox after that tournament won't even be on this roster. It'll be Phelps. In the same vein, Immortals have basically done the same thing with FNX in this major cycle, but it's so basically they were playing with this guy, and you would think, okay, yeah, maybe he's not your go-to guy, but maybe you want to ride it out to the major because he is skilled. Immortals as a team was pretty good. He has the experience. Maybe you want this guy to help you at least run through the major before you kick him, but even then it was apparently too much, and now he's been removed and been replaced by KNG. So the question now is, how will FNX's story end? Because generally a kick is actually a source of motivation for certain types of players, because a kick is basically, it's an attack on the ego, and nothing inspires a good player more than when they feel like their ego's been hit. Famously, somebody like Taz come out and basically take every like comment as if it was an insult to his personal character or on his team, and then he'd use that to fire himself up and his team in order to go win, like Vegas, for example. But in this case, FNX didn't really have that kind of fire, or maybe he had that fire, but he was still unwilling to change himself as a person, and that wasn't enough. So now the question for FNX is, can he change his character? Because that is what's holding him back. It's not really his skill. It's not. Maybe it is his lack of motivation, but he himself as a player is still very good. So for FNX, this is where the story can either change or it will end. Whether or not he will be able to change who he is as a person, change who he is as a player, and whether or not that change stays. If not, this is the end. As Neil Gaiman says in the Sandman comic, you either change or you die.